Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Cutting Through the Bullshit. I am your host, Dr. Stephanie Snyder, and I am a high performance mentor. Through my unique blend of strategy, mindset, and intuition, I help men and women to cut through the BS in order to create the life and business they desire. So this morning I was at a networking event. I'm trying to get out there and meet more people. I've lived here long enough that I feel like I should have a larger network than I do. And what was interesting was we were going around the table and we were talking about kind of our leadership styles or how we interact with people. And what was interesting was the idea of being honest with ourselves, but even deeper than that, how are we speaking to ourselves? And so there was a woman who had asked a question, and she said, if you're somebody who's, kind of a high achiever, how do you speak to yourself in a way that isn't dominating and belittling? And I shared with her an exercise that I do. And but my husband thinks I'm crazy because I do have these different kind of parts of me that I talk through. And this is an exercise from Debbie Ford, Dark Side of the Light Chasers, where she has you like name these different parts of you and have conversations with them, because the goal is to actually become a whole self where you love all of the parts of you, not just the ones that you believe are valuable. And so I like to have different conversations with myself as I coach myself through it. It really is kind of a coaching process. And so I shared in the group that I have 4 kids, as many of you know. My son is 18 and my daughters are 15, 10, and 7. And so I kind of use them as my model of how to speak to myself, because there was a time where I was really nasty to myself. I had nothing kind to say to myself, and I was constantly beating myself up for not being good enough, for not making enough money, for not being successful here, or for being a failure there, or whatever it was. There was a time when I constantly kicked the crap out of myself. And I remember when I first was brought awareness about this, I was actually coming up the stairs right here to my office, and I had a plastic container of push pins. And as I was coming up the stairs, I was dumping the push pins into another container, but I had forgotten to take the top off of that container, and I went to dump the push pins in, and they went everywhere. And my immediate reaction to myself was, Steph, you're such an idiot. And I remember catching myself in that moment and going, oh, that's not good. That's not how I want to speak to myself, because that's not how I want to speak to my kids. And if I speak to myself that way, there's nothing stopping me from speaking to anybody else that way. And so I had to, one, create awareness around this, but also begin to respond to myself and to speak to myself in a very different way. And so, yeah, there are some mornings, there are some times during the day where I catch myself being mean. But oftentimes when I come up against something, I literally take that part of me and I have a conversation with it. And more often than not, I imagine having that conversation with one of my kids. And so oftentimes when it comes to this kind of work, you'll hear people talk about your inner child. Well, when I talk to my inner child, I see my 7-year-old daughter for that age, right? There's an inner teenager, right? So each of my kids is this stage where I find myself gravitating towards the conversation with that particular child. And oftentimes my whininess, my immaturity, emotional immaturity, is me imagining a conversation with my 7-year-old. And so how would I speak to my 7-year-old in a way in which I'm showing her love, I'm showing her kindness, and I'm still listening to her, but also guiding her, right? Being a mentor to her as a 7-year-old, a 10-year-old, 15-year-old, 18-year-old, whatever it is, right? And so I've changed the way that I speak to myself, because I don't ever want to speak to my kids in a way in which it belittles them. I don't want to ever feel so frustrated that I'm calling them names. And so when I get frustrated, I can't resort to calling myself a name. And so how you speak to yourself is incredibly impactful. Not only that, but are you able to build the trust with yourself? Because if you were feeling really frustrated and you started to belittle yourself, is that going to encourage you to do better? Probably not, right? And so how do I want to be encouraged? Well, that's how I speak to myself. Right? Like some of you may know this if you've hung out here since the beginning of the year. The beginning of the year, I started doing one push-up a day, adding one push-up each week. And so this week I actually started 20 push-ups. And I went to do the push-ups this morning and I was feeling real tired. I didn't want to do them, but I know that if I get them out of the way at the beginning of the day, then I don't have to worry about it the rest of the day and I don't make up all these other excuses, right? And so I'm doing these push-ups and I got to 15 and I was like, whew. And I started to think, I don't know that I can make it to 20. I don't know that I can make it to 20. But I stopped myself and I said, you know what? We got 5 more. Just take it one at a time. One at a time. And I made it to 20. And what's really interesting is when I first started this, I remember 9 push-ups being very hard. And now I can bust through 15 push-ups without really even breaking a sweat. So I just want you to begin to pay attention. The way that you speak to yourself impacts more than you. And so try to give yourself the grace and the kindness, because would you speak to your best friend that way? If your best friend came to you, or one of your kids, or someone that you love very, very, very much, okay, whatever, kid, mom, parent, friend, whatever. If that person came to you for advice, how would you speak to them? Probably with grace, love, and kindness, right? And so I encourage you to begin to pay attention to how you speak to yourself. And maybe it needs some changing, but you can't change it until you're aware of it. And so just notice it. If you're feeling frustrated, if you're feeling hungry, you're tired, you're exhausted, you're whatever, right? How are you talking to yourself? And yeah, sometimes there's going to be this crazy one-off thought. The kids all call them intruding thoughts or invasive thoughts, right? Sometimes there's this invasive thought that comes in and you're like, where in God's creation did that come from? Right? But how you speak to yourself, that is something that you do have power over. And so I really want to challenge you to begin to look at that. Are you speaking to yourself in a way that is encouraging and supportive? Or are you speaking to yourself in a way that it wouldn't get anybody out of bed? So I challenge you to look at that. And as always, be you, because the world needs more of you. Bye.